We get started?
Yes.
Everyone ready? Okay, that's fine. I'm going to close that down. Mary, did you want to say a couple of words, or are you fine?
Well, I just wanted to thank our three presenters for this roundtable. The roundtable came about because of, a sort of growing interest in decolonisation, which I think probably came as a surprise to some people, thinking that, okay, we've done decolonisation, but of course we've seen this new interest in decolonisation now, which is extending to the university and to education, and I think to a large extent this roundtable in a way comes out of that. So I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for the invitation, and well done to everyone involved in the conference for getting this online. I think that's really exciting and very valuable indeed, especially from the perspective of decolonisation and participation and that kind of thing. So thanks very much. My name is Meera Savaratnam, and I'm going to be chairing this roundtable. I'll first introduce my co-panelists, and then I'll explain how the roundtable will be set up. So I'm very delighted to have with me Olivier Rutazibwa, who's a Belgian Rwandan IR scholar and senior lecturer in European and International Development Studies at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, and also senior research fellow at the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Studies, from which she's just returned. Her PhD in political science and international relations is from Ghent University, and her research and teaching focuses on ways to decolonize international solidarity. Building on epistemic blackness, in her research she turns to recovering and reconnecting philosophies and practices of dignity and repair and retreat in the post-colony. And I think she's going to talk a bit more to us about that shortly. She's published in various academic journals, including Millennium Journal of International Studies, Postcolonial Studies, the Journal of Intervention and State Building, and the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. And she's co-editor of various books, including the Routledge Handbook of Postcolonial Politics. In 2011, she delivered a TEDx talk called Decolonizing Western Minds. So she's been in the heart of this debate within IR for a long time. As has my other co-panelist, Zeynep Gulşah-Kapan, who's a lecturer at the Chair Group of International Relations at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Her research focuses on critical theories of international relations, history and historiography, the Eurocentrism of the field of IR, the sociology of knowledge, and post-colonial and decolonial thought. Her book, Rewriting International Relations, was published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2016, and she's published in journals such as Third World Quarterly and Review of International Studies. She's been section convener for the EISA conferences in Sicily, Izmir, Prague, and Sofia, and she's organised EWIS workshops in Tübingen and Groningen. I should get my Dutch pronunciation correct. So it's a real pleasure to be here alongside Olivia and Gulşah. A small bit about myself. I am senior lecturer in international relations at SOAS University of London. And for a couple of years now, I have been the chair of a working group called the Decolonizing SOAS Working Group, which is a direct institutional response to try to engage with the demand to decolonize the curriculum and decolonize the university. So essentially this working group has been tasked with fleshing out what concretely that means. I've also been using post-colonial and decolonial thought in my own work, in my own research, and particularly trying to apply it across theory, methodology, and data analysis as well, which I've done in my recent book. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation going. We're conscious that everybody has quite different starting points around questions of decolonization, and some of the participants might be very familiar with the debates on it, others might be not at all familiar at all. So just to encourage everybody that this is a very open space, that there is no such thing as a too simple or too stupid question, particularly when we're using terms which are so contested as in this field, including decolonization, race, coloniality, and so on. So I hope we can have a really nice conversation. So what I will do now is I will briefly outline, I think, the sort of broad stakes of where the debate is around what it means to decolonize the curriculum and academia in general. I'll talk about this in quite general terms without fleshing out the underpinning assumptions. So that might be something that we come back to in the Q&A. And then Olivia Gulcher and I will have a conversation around a few different topics, which will include the discipline in the field, questions around teaching, questions around sort of political life and how that relates. And finally, we'll try and think about the future. Now, we do have the Ask a Question Q&A function enabled in this webinar. I'm not proposing as chair to look at that until we've done our sort of first rounds, but I'll try and keep an eye on it thereafter to make sure we do get to questions. It's a shame not to be able to see your faces. There's a lot of people in the room though, so please do engage, ask questions, and we'll try to engage with as many of them as possible. All right. Okay, so I hope I'm going at the right kind of speed. Those who can see me, if you can nod. Yes? Good. Thank you very much. All right, so let's set the scene. Why are we talking about decolonisation now? And Mary asked this good question, which is one I think which naturally comes to mind, like, hasn't decolonisation happened? Didn't it happen in the 50s and 60s? Why are we still going on about it? So I suppose one of the key premises of the decolonisation movement today, and probably in the middle of the 20th century as well, is that there's a distinction between formal political decolonisation or formal political independence of societies in Asia and Africa from legalised European rule, and the nature of the structural hierarchies which have been embedded in world society since then, still being present, still exercising forms of control, power, violence, and the rest of it. So the movement to decolonize, when we talk about it now, is to examine the continuing influence of colonialism and coloniality in the way in which we think about the world, the way we speak about the world, the way in which the world materially manifests itself in terms of the organization of the economy and the organization of the state, and to push ourselves in a way to do better, right? To make good on the promise of decolonization, which was a promise for human equality, which was a promise for a much more pluralized world, and one which had a sort of common dignity and respect. So those are the broad parameters that we're looking at. And in terms of recent years, those of you who have been following the story will know this history quite well. In university campuses in particular, the recent agitations most visibly began in, say, 2014-15 in South Africa, with the demand for the statue of Cecil Rhodes to be brought down in the University of Cape Town. Cecil Rhodes, of course, was an agent of British imperialism, responsible for developing mining and other enterprises in southern Africa, responsible for annexing large parts of territory, for violence committed against Africans in those territories, and so on. Anyway, so Rhodes has, however, got a large kind of legacy as a benefactor of various educational missions, one of which is in the University of Cape Town. So as part of the legacy building of Rhodes, statues were put up, not just in South Africa, but also, as we know, in Oxford. So South African students now, part of the what are called the born free generation, born after the end of apartheid, have been examining the ways in which, despite the end of apartheid, the society is still very unequal, right? The representation of Black students and academics in the universities is very low. Poverty is still incredibly racialized. Access to educational opportunities, jobs, and so on, still is very much in terms of race. So in terms of how the students wanted to reappropriate the university, or rethink what the university space should be, they objected to a symbol of that violence, Cecil Rhodes, being still venerated in that space, but also they wanted to look at how the curriculum was designed. They wanted to think about how access to university worked. And this developed not just into a demand for symbolic reparations, but into a material demand called Fees Must Fall. So following on from South Africa, we saw uprisings and movements in universities across the world. I'm most familiar with the English-speaking world, but maybe Olivia and Gulsha can speak to other contexts as well. But we saw demands, particularly to decolonize the curriculum and to make the curriculum less white. Now, what does it mean to say the curriculum is white? It's an interesting question. I think people involved in the movement have different conceptions of what this means and why it's an issue. In a broad sense, I think there are two dimensions that we talk about in SOAS, and we developed a learning and teaching toolkit as part of the group in order to pick out this problem. The first dimension is informative. That is to say that the content of the curriculum centers the experiences and the imaginations of those who are racialized as white in whatever field it happens to be. So in politics, in economics, in history, and literature, and so on. To the exclusion of writers, thinkers, even subject matter from other parts of the world. The second element is what we might think of as the performative dimension. And this element means that in a representational sense, the sort of visual diversity of our curricula is also very white, right? It's all particular kinds of people, male, upper class, originating from a particular part of the world, who are the authority figures in terms of who we should look at, who we should think about. Now, this is a problem for two reasons, right? The first reason is because we have a very narrow set of subject matters and perspectives from which to think about the world. And the second problem is that, particularly for students and scholars of color, this kind of absents them from the field, right? They don't feel like this is a space in which they can participate. So this is about the democracy of the educational space itself. In a more substantive sense, when we think about a field like political science or international relations, the colonial construction of the field has meant several things. So yes, there's this primacy of the West, focus on the West, and the assumption that the West is the most kind of progressive part of the world. But it also undermines a number of the kind of categories and claims. So we have a very ahistorical account of state formation. We have an obscuring of the ways in which the colonial economy contributed to the wealth of Europe. We have an ignoring of the ways in which identities based in racialized categories have shaped nationalisms and other kinds of relations within Europe and further abroad. And so we don't deconstruct these elements of the political system, right? We're supposed to be scholars that are analyzing these things critically, but we don't touch these particular elements. So when we talk about decolonizing the field, what we're thinking about are several connected things. First is making that colonial and imperial history visible, right? Where did these relationships come from? Where did these states come from? How did Europe become wealthy? What is the aid relationship, and so on. Second, we're talking about pluralization, right? What other stories are there out there about power, about violence, about statehood, about sovereignty, about democracy, all of these questions. Third, we're thinking about, can we reorganize the field to bring these contrasts and these contestations into greater relief? And fourth, we're thinking about, can we reimagine what it means to study these topics and these subjects? So we study these topics and these subjects with an assumption that different parts of the world and different peoples matter as much as, let's say, the Western experience. Now, these things need to be worked out, and they're different in different contexts. What it means to decolonize in South Africa and what it means to decolonize in Oxford are different, because part of it is about making the academy more responsive to the population around it, and that is a different population, clearly. What are the outcomes that we can have? So I'm quite an optimist about this project and what it promises, both in terms of its intellectual payoffs and in terms of its political payoffs, right? So intellectually, I would argue that once you start thinking about the world through these lenses, you can see more of it. More issues are visible, more types of relationships are visible, more kinds of problems come into view. So in my own research for my PhD, I was looking at post-war state building in Mozambique. And the typical question that we might ask from the West is, why does something fail or why does something succeed, right? And so that was a question that I went into my PhD with. If you start looking at it from a sort of decolonizing perspective, which I would argue is more embedded in the experiences and the thought of the people on the ground, then the question becomes, why does this keep failing even when we know what's wrong with it? And then you have a different set of answers about the political relationships that lead to those outcomes. So I won't go on for too much longer because I think I've spoken quite a lot already, but we'll, the last thing I'll just say is that these are really difficult and painful questions to address, not just within the academy, but outside it. And I think a lot of us who have been in this conversation space for a while have encountered antagonisms, we've encountered abuse, we've encountered a lot of, honest questions as well. And one of the things that I think all of us need to negotiate is how we have the conversation as well as having the conversation itself. So that's something that I just want to throw out there as well. Okay, so that is a brief introduction. I hope that's given the sort of parameters of the issues for those who are either unfamiliar with it or less familiar with it. I'm now going to bring in my co-panelists, Olivia and Gaucha, and I'll start with Olivia. So Olivia, you grew up in Belgium, and I think your training was in political science and IR. How did you come to the questions of sort of decolonization and decoloniality?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, that was a really good introduction. So I was thinking about this question and trying to think, should I start with the beginning or maybe immediately start with the present, right? Like in terms of how do we make sense of this decolonization project in a way that doesn't feel like, oh, we're going back to the past. And so just waking up again to the news, we read out these names, Jacob Blake, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And anybody of us can then translate this into similar processes in our own countries. It doesn't have to be the US. And obviously there is more attention to the US for many imperial reasons, but or then bring it back to, if we study the international or political processes, the things that we need to make sense of these things that actually don't make sense, but mostly also how we manage to go through life maybe by not paying attention. So for one or the other reason, these names now pop up in our news reels, but often they don't. And so for me, it actually, if I think about it now, it's trying to make a connection between those things that are in our face, like these names, and then the same logics that actually lock up whole swaths of people in continents in which Black lives or non-white lives continue not to matter, right? So that's very broadly speaking for me, how I make sense, and not just about, oh, it would be interesting to decolonize, but it's actually maybe quite urgent and slightly more urgent than we think. More autobiographical then. So I was born and raised in Belgium from Rwandan parents. And now when I backtrack, I know that what led me to study international relations or even politics was trying to make sense of 1994 when we have a genocide. And it's not just that the genocide happens, which is a tragedy in and of itself that could, spur somebody to study politics or study how people live together, anything to do with the social sciences. But I remember even as a teenager being really stunned by the fact that the UN decided to leave at the eve of the genocide, right? So it was not even a tiny technical failing or we could have saved more lives, but literally they left. And the practical reason is obviously 10 Belgian paramilitaries are killed very deliberately, and they were there for the UN at the night that the genocide starts. And so I think everything I learned after that in my IR classroom or textbooks actually socialized me in finding it quite natural that we killed 10 of them and then the whole caravan leaves, right? But again, for me, what I started to realize after a long, long time is that my discipline somehow socializes me in finding that more normal than actually asking why a system like the UN, who was set up and who's been, who gets its legitimacy from actually the opposite, which is the protection of life, and especially life in context of conflict, right? And so it took me a really long time. So I took a long time to do my PhD in terms of, I decided then for my PhD to look at EU foreign policy, especially relations with Africa. And again, what I've been socialized in was thinking the ethical thing for the EU to do is to do more and to be more ethical, to give more money, to assist more in development, in democratization, in conflict prevention, any of these things, right? And so I have to say that by the very end of my PhD, I finally encountered some decolonial thought, Mira, especially also through your work, where I realized that I was literally asking the wrong question. And a bit like you were saying about Mozambique, where it's not like, how does this fail, but how does this keep failing, was where I started thinking, why are we not studying what happens when there is no international intervention or when people know that they can't count on the international community? What happens then? So how do we not even study the absence of those international actors or historical actors that often have been at the source of the problems, but we study them only as potential solutions. And then they almost also never end up being the solutions, but we keep on teaching them as if they are part of the solution, right? So that's how I started being interested in the case of Somaliland, where there was a tiny moment in history where there was a relative absence of the international community. And so what happens, and that's what I'm still interested in today, so how do we understand both peacemaking, society building, but also very much solidarity, where we refuse the reproduction of the colonial elements in international relations? And I would say that, and I'll come back to it, but the coloniality in international relations outside the discipline, but just literally the relations that we have on the international scene, is those many things that we continue to completely erase or eclipse. And a lot of it is historical, right? Where we can end up as an international community that tends to be westernized to a large extent as the firefighters, but we stop studying the arsonist elements of it or anything that actually came to it, so that we have to do something today. So for me, it was a very personal thing, but then today also, because I teach international development, is very much at the heart of how to study the international. If we don't want to be too cynical about good intentions, how do we manage to not reproduce colonial impositions when we do that?
Thank you, Olivia. Gulsha.
I feel like everything has been covered, but I'll sort of start from the personal autobiographical journey as well, in terms of why did I end up with, or how did I end up with postcolonial and decolonial theory, which was in a sense very accidental. Just going to the beginning, I was born in Istanbul, but my mother was from Istanbul. My father was from the southeast of Turkey, on the border with Syria. That comes back into the story later. And at age 8, I left to Spain. I lived 4 years in Spain. And then I went to Geneva, and then lived 5-6 years in Geneva, and then went back to Turkey to start university. And initially I was going to study literature because I was sort of more into the humanities, right? What constitutes a subject? How do you narrate sort of things? I don't know how I ended up in international relations. So that really, I have no explanation. But I do remember the first couple of courses where I felt nothing they were telling me made sense. Because they kept talking about, for example, the basic concepts of international relations, sovereignty, right? And if you go from a very simple definition, this is about absolute authority within a territorially defined space. And basics of international relations, that's the national, and outside is the international. So here you have domestic politics, outside is foreign, all that stuff. And I kept thinking, this doesn't make sense. And you don't even have to go into like very obscure examples. Just the example from Spain was, I remember going to Gibraltar every couple of months. And you keep thinking, how the hell is Gibraltar there? And UK is there, but Gibraltar is part of the UK, right? Can someone explain this to me? And the thing was, whenever I came up with these weird examples, the professors were like, yeah, that's one example. It doesn't, you know, in any way influence the theory of it. And then, of course, you have the question of these borders. And this is where the southeastern part of Turkey comes in, because for my family, anyone who's on the side of Syria is not actually in a different country. They're just cousins in the next village. So again, this idea that there's this inside and outside and all these borders, it just empirically didn't make sense. So it wasn't the truth, right? So the question I kept coming back to was, why do we keep creating these concepts that are not based on any sort of truth? I mean, even within Europe, it is not based on truth, right? It doesn't really align with reality. And we actually all know that it doesn't align with reality, but we continue with these concepts. So that was one of the starting points. And then I made a very, very wrong deduction. And I said to myself, well, this must be an international relations problem. I'll go study history. So I went and studied history. And I learned that it wasn't an international relations problem. It was a general, you know, knowledge, the way we've constructed science and the way we've constructed knowledge problem. But coming to that, again, took a couple of more years until the end of the PhD, where I think towards the end, similar to Olivia, I came to the question and said, I asked the wrong question. The question, I mean, the main question was how Eurocentrism gets reproduced. And within the limits of that, it made sense, but the actual question should have been more about what knowledge means, right? It should have gone there. But it took a long time to get there. And I think it was towards the middle of the PhD thesis where I sort of discovered postcolonial theory, right? And initially it was actually very confusing in the sense that, you know, you don't actually, I mean, now Olivia has the handbook, and thank you for that. But before that, you know, there wasn't a handbook. So you couldn't just go in and say, okay, this is how you do this in international relations. So I think there was a lot of back and forth with postcolonial theory, decolonial theory, in terms of trying to understand what the issue actually is that has been bothering me, which I think I am just coming to be able to articulate. And that's where the decolonization part comes in the sense that this wasn't just about a discipline being, you know, missing out on things. This is generally about the coloniality of knowledge. And unless we do decolonize it, we will keep reproducing those issues within all of the disciplines. So that's basically how I came.
Okay. Good. I mean, I think I really appreciate those answers. And just in the interests of kind of moving the discussion forward, both of you have touched quite a lot on the sort of disciplinary implications of coloniality and for how we think about the world. Can we move maybe to teaching and think about what this means? Because everyone's talking about decolonizing the curriculum. And I can't remember the first time I heard this phrase, must have been in sort of 2015 or so. I'd been thinking about the problem of Eurocentrism and decolonizing research prior to that, but it hadn't ever struck me that this is something that you would bring into the classroom, bizarrely, I mean, until relatively late. How have you sought to think about this in the context of your own teaching, and how have the students responded? Maybe go back to Olivia.
So I teach international development studies, and I usually start the year by saying, no, I even started my job interview by saying that I think development aid in itself is a colonial construct of governance. So that somehow, once you start formulating it like that, and what I actually mean with it is that, if you think of a history of robbery and murder, and I'm simplifying a lot, but I think people will understand what I'm trying to say. If you decide not to conceal the history of robbery and murder over time, and then you turn around and say, and now we're going to give you aid, then you understand how development studies as a construct in and of itself is not a neutral enterprise. And to some extent, especially if we move away from Eurocentrism, it can be a bit obscene, right? So how do you deal then in your teaching to deliver on a degree that is supposedly training students to be active in that field or in that mindset? Again, like I said, without being super cynical, but also, you know, the moment you choose to teach in that, you have a responsibility to do something with it. So that has been my struggle in how do I teach something that I am actually categorically against, but I also do think we really, from an intellectual point of view, but also political, we need to know exactly how that system works to understand what are the imaginations or the options that we have to do something else, right? So one thing is that I try to make a distinction between development aid as an industry, let's say, or as a collection of technologies and institutions on the one hand, and then the idea of solidarity and all the many different ways that could look like. So I usually start my year also by asking students how they ended up in that classroom and why they chose that. And there's obviously a variation that includes something like saving African children or something like that, but also in general, it's about connecting with the world and being and having a positive contribution to the world. Yeah. I mean, I'm simply, again, and so throughout, I think one of the first decolonial steps then is how do you constantly remind them of that distinction between the institutions that we have, and then we unpack the extent to which those are part of a colonial mindset, let's say, and then the genuine desire, but also the task that we have to be a positive contribution in the world. And so in concrete terms, what that has meant is, for instance, asking the question, where do we start the story about the need for development aid? And I know that a lot of handbooks would start, for instance, with the speech of President Truman of the US, 1949, where it declares that, you know, let's help the rest of the world. Again, I'm simplifying. But it actually doesn't make sense to start the development aid story there, because it would assume that everything that came before that is quite marginal to why we need to have a whole infrastructure of aid to begin with. So the first changes I did, I think, and when I say I mean a lot of energy is also put in discussing this with colleagues and making sure it aligns with the whole team and everything. And I think in terms of decolonization, it's not just what do we change in terms of content, but it's also a different ethos of working together. And I think collaboration is a big part of that.
Sorry,
yeah.
No, I just wanted to, just to push you on that little thing, because development studies is the place where all the people with all the very best intentions try to wind up, right? I mean, we were all brought up in this context where to help poor Africans is basically the best thing you can do, right? It's the most heroic, most generous thing. And so that mythology is very deeply ingrained in all of us. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it must be quite disruptive for the students.
In a way, it's easier because sometimes I also teach those that do that chose to do law or chose to do IR. It's easier actually to tap into students' well-meaning reason for being there than those that sit in a classroom thinking that there is something like an objective approach to reality, right? So in a way, I have to say, like, if I compare this, it's easier to decolonize, even though it's more painful. I agree with that. And students also express that very often. The way to deal with that is to be very honest about the own painful elements that we've had in coming to all these discoveries, right? But there is an openness to it because we don't dismiss the desire to do good, right? But we dismiss all that we have been taught so far in how to go about that. And so in the beginning, I started first by changing modules in the last years of undergraduate. And then the reaction was always, how can you have us, you know, have a degree for 2-3 years and only at the end you tell us that everything is rubbish? And it's true, there is something quite irresponsible about that. So now we've changed to first year's core modules. Very brief example, there was a core module. You know how our first year's modules are always introduction to something, right? So it was introduction to the developing world. I've changed that now to a module, it's the same module, but it's called The Making of the Global South. And the first term, we start in 1492 rather than in 1949. And so for every week, then we look at a different moment in time in both how the global South or coloniality or the inequalities were made, but also all the different resistances. So then you also end up talking about the Haitian Revolution in the beginning of the degree, rather than stuffing it completely at the end, where you're like, oh, by the way, people have always resisted this. So that's, but the reactions have been overall positive, but it's also because we changed the way that we teach that. It's not just like lecturing, but a lot of it is interactive, so that there is a lot of space to think out loud and also together. So it involves a lot of things that is not just the content. So you have to change the content, the starting point, but also the practices of teaching, I would say.
Thank you. Okay, so to Gulsha as well, similar question. And also, I mean, you teach in Germany, and it would be interesting to reflect on, I mean, we've both been talking about Anglophone context, but if you could reflect on how the conversation goes there with your students.
Yeah, I mean, to start off, I think that there is much less regulatory aspect in the German case, in the sense that I sort of decide on the course I want to give and how I want to organize it and what I want to add to the syllabus. So there's pretty much no limit to what I can do. So I think that also gives me a freedom that if I, were teaching, and I did teach, for example, in Turkey, something I wouldn't be able to do, right? So part of what you're able to do is then sort of dictated by certain institutional limitations. So that has to be taken into account. I mean, just an example into how much no one cares what I teach is one of the courses is on witches, really. So, it's about the construction of witches, zombies, and which then goes into knowledge systems. But I'll sort of give an example because it sort of ties into what Olivia was mentioning. The course on postcolonial theory that I teach, because I think a similar pattern happens there, where towards the end they look at you and say, we thought you were going to give us an answer, right? Because they do come in with all the good intentions, right? If they're taking the course, they're interested and they want to learn. And I think there is a certain aspect where they want you to give them this easy answer where suddenly it all makes sense. And what I try to now tell them at the beginning is you're going to sort of end the seminar with more questions than answers. And actually that is the aim, right? So going back to something Mira was saying in the beginning, if you're able to see more injustices, right, in the world at the end, which will actually make you more frustrated, more angry. But that's the aim, is that to be able to see more rather than not see a lot of things. And one of the things then I start to sort of shift their perspective is to say, in the opening session is to ask, if you have to write a paper, what do you want to write on, right? And they start with these great projects, and somehow none of them are, they're all about the global South, right? They want to apply postcolonial theory to the global South because that's what postcolonial theory is, right? It's not theory that you can apply anywhere. It's a theory you apply to the global South. And this is the start of the conversation then, to tell them, actually, we have to just take this as theory in itself, rather than say, I can take Fanon and apply it to decolonization. Maybe we can take Fanon and apply it to Black Lives Matter, right? Or we take Fanon and apply him to what's happening with the Kurdish situation in Turkey, right? So why do we think of it as specifically tied to a location, whereas we would not think of that if we're talking about Foucault, right? And that's the shifting that I want them to sort of go through in terms of saying, why don't you apply one of these theories to being from East Germany, right? Because there's all sorts of hierarchies involved there. Why not look at that? And then the second aspect of it is to sort of break down theory even more, which goes back to this, again, notion of, what constitutes knowledge or legitimate knowledge, right? And one of the things is, if we actually go to the sources of postcolonial and decolonial theory, they don't actually come from academics or professors at university chairs or any of those people, right? They come from activists. They come from people who wrote literature, theater plays, all those places. That's where the theory is. And then it's about saying, okay, let's break down what we understand from theory, so that 1 week we will read a theater play from Aimé Césaire, and then there's actually a week where we I forget the name now. Anyway, so I'll pass it. But where we the other one is where we actually listen to songs from Low Key. I don't know if anyone knows about them, but so that's actually theorization for me, right? But how do we then, explain the world, or how are they explaining the world to us through different mediums that do not enter into our accepted knowledge systems, which then what they end up doing after that is to actually look at the world and even European knowledge system in a way that says, what we understand to be European knowledge is also a constructed and actually a very limited version of what European knowledge is.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of it gets, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that we have plenty of questions. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think we are kind of in agreement with a lot of the parameters. I mean, in terms of our own experiences at SOAS, I won't say very much, but we've had a really interesting experience with the students driving the agenda and then trying to translate it into institutional practice without impinging on colleagues' academic freedom or in terms of their authority to decide what constitutes expertise and so on, but by trying to make it more of a conversation really rather than a one-way street. I'm going to ask I'm going to ask the audience to start maybe populating the Q&As. I can see one that's come up already. But for this last little round of questions, I'd like us to think about how this relates to what's going on in society. I know, Olivia, you said a bit more about it, but it strikes me, and I think it's worth making clear, that there's an explicit connection, I think, amongst most of the scholars in this field, that the parochialism or provincialism or Eurocentrism or coloniality of the academic space is reflected in and co-constituted with racial hierarchy in society more generally. That is to say that ideas about Muslims or Black people in the scholarship are part of discrimination against them in wider society. But one of the things that we find when we go into that broader social and political space is that there isn't really a space to have the conversation in a way which you can go through the different premises and the arguments and the questioning with the public. Actually, what we have is this very polarized, to a certain extent, constructed culture war between people who want to preserve our culture and people who want to destroy it, right? And so having a scholarly conversation, or not even a scholarly conversation, but having a conversation which is reflexive about Europe's colonial past, how it engages with its present, how it engages with its citizens, how it engages with its non-citizens, what it thinks about in terms of its global obligations, is all quite difficult. So just a last, well, not a last, but a sort of, at least for this section of the panel, to go to Olivia and Gulsha, and I'll start with you, Gulsha. How would you respond to the idea that something like decolonization is in tension with intellectual pluralism or academic freedom? Like, does it require us to think in a certain way? Does it require us to say Europe is bad and everything is colonial and everything is racist? And if we don't do that, then we're being complicit in racism. Like, is it a limit as well? I mean, and have you found that conversation when you've tried to take this forward? Sorry to bring that one on you.
Yeah, I'm just going to mute myself and no, but I'm not sure I have an answer. I think it's very hard to sort of navigate. I think you get it when you teach as well, in terms of a certain defensiveness after a point, right? Initially, students might be very interested, but after a while, they might get a little defensive in terms of, well, are we all racist then? Are we all, when do we stop being blamed? It becomes sort of a reaction. And I think that's sort of a very human reaction. So one of the things I try to tell the students, and I try to tell myself as well, because none of us are completely exempt from it, I think. We like to think we are, but most of the time, I'm not sure we are. Is to sort of, again, it goes back to the seeing and unseeing, right? This is not a question of sort of being a bad person or being evil or any of those things, which sort of, I think, what a lot of people react to as if they're being blamed for something. But it's actually very systemic. And as people who are part of that system, we do all participate in its reproduction at different degrees. Mm. And the question then is trying to find ways in which we participate in its reproduction and try to minimize that. Right? So it's not this great project that tomorrow morning I'm going to, wake up and be, completely non-racist or something. And I'm not sure that's possible. The question is to always be, to understand that you should be able to see more, which goes back to this question, when I was mentioning at the beginning about knowing things, right? And the question was, the problem with everything that we do is not that we don't know things. We already have the knowledge. Like, no one realized the Haitian Revolution happened 10 years ago. They knew, right? Everyone knew. And it's the same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? George Floyd wasn't the first Black man to be killed. We all knew, right? And that is the issue, in the sense that we all knew, but we weren't all equally outraged. Right. And that is the question to ask ourselves, is how do I become equally outraged? And if you're not, that is something to think about in terms of your privilege, that you can go through life not being as equally outraged, even though you know that these deaths are happening.
Yeah. Right? Thank you. Olivia, do you want to add to that in terms of this question about maybe what tensions or confrontations you experience when we talk about decolonization?
Yeah, I think Gulsa's approach to look at it in terms of knowledge is very useful, especially as academics that try to also be meaningful outside the ivory tower, let's say, but it's also useful for insight. And for me, what decolonial thought has brought as a liberation is indeed, first of all, this idea that knowledge is already there. So we don't even need to be that worried about being new or discovering stuff, or that in itself is a very colonial understanding of knowledge. Knowledge, we can consider it's all there, and it's just that for very particular reasons, systematically ways of thinking and people as thinkers have been erased from whatever we're doing. And so for me, that's why the whole decolonial move is in and of itself an exciting intellectual enterprise, because it's not a cancel culture, nor is it censorship. It's actually the opposite. It's actually understanding that so far we've been tapping into 6% of what we could know about, and we just decide to open it up. In addition to that, because it's not just Discovery Channel or National Geographic, it's not just interest, right? It's that you actually, I think we are invited to to answer the question, why do we want to know something? So what is its purpose? And even more specifically, how does it relate to the status quo? And I think as decolonial scholars or people interested in anti-colonialism is the recognition that the way we know things now and how we organize society is deeply colonial, not the flag planting historical colonialism, and even that there's still colonies, but the whole idea of extreme power inequality that we then maintain through the different institutions that we have. So how do you translate that to the racist uncle at the Christmas table that we all know about, or just, you know, public opinion in general? I would say by circling back to the fact that the idea that racism is something we can boil down to individual good or bad people is a very neoliberal tool at the service of the status quo. So that we can just discuss who's a good person, a bad person, whatever. But racism in and of itself has always been linked to racial capitalism and the whole structure. And that makes it much more difficult. So then it's actually, in a very simplistic way, often I say to people, how would we have this conversation if it wasn't about you? And it wasn't even about me as individuals, but literally about how we want to imagine our world differently. Because usually people come to the conversation wanting to solve a particular problem, even if it's not Black Lives Matters. People are mourning about something in society. So that's how I would approach it. Like, how do we contribute to knowledge that is explicitly trying to move against the colonial status quo, the racist status quo? And just reassure people, oh, you're not a bad person, whatever. That usually opens the door. However tiring that is, as you can imagine, but push back on that.
Good, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists to take some time to look through the Q&A, and I don't think we'll all have time to maybe input on all of the questions there, but if you could pick out questions that you're going to answer. I'll say a couple of things about this issue about public life, and then maybe we'll start taking some questions, and they're quite long, articulate questions, so we might take a little while to process them, and maybe we'll read them out loud in order to answer them. So, but I wanted to just build off what you were saying, Olivia, as to how we speak to people about these things, given their very pervasive structural nature, their very deeply embedded sort of knee-jerk kind of place that this has. I did an event this time last week with the Imperial War Museum, and of course a lot of the constituency of the Imperial War Museum in the UK is people who are proud of and who want to celebrate Britain's military history, especially World War II, the Blitz, Hitler, all of the rest of it, and World War I. And it's been interesting that through a lot of the recent war commemorations, in light of these more public debates on decolonisation, one thing you've found is an increased emphasis on Black and brown soldiers who fought for the British Army and died alongside white soldiers. So it's a sort of response to the, well, you know, white working class men died for Britain, right? And that's what remembering war is about. It's really about remembering white working class men. And so part of it has been like, hey, did you know that there was a Sikh battalion in Ypres, or, you know, whatever the situation was? Did you know that soldiers from Pakistan fought on the beaches in Normandy, right? And these kinds of questions. But it's interesting because it's a very ambiguous space to be in, because on the one hand, you're reaffirming national identity as the primary kind of claim to belonging, and you're seeking to make it more diverse, but it's still militarized, it's still imperial, it's not able to challenge the parameters of the debate itself. It's more of a like, no, we're here too kind of thing. So to go from that to a bigger question, which is, you know, how do we think not just about the people who volunteered to fight for Britain and who are proud to fight for Britain, but the same people who were conscripted to produce various commodities, or who were, you know, forced to give up their lands in order to have those things farmed. And can we include them in our conception of ourselves, right? Or are they still others? So this is a sort of tension in the debate. Okay, I'd like now to turn to our audience questions and the webinar, and I think there's already quite a lot of questions, so I will give the panel the privilege of picking the ones that they want to answer. I'm sorry, this is a very unsatisfactory way to deal with questions. In a real live space, you would be able to demand these things, but you guys have been muted, you've been silenced. So we are going to be able to sort of slightly pick and choose. We'll try and get to everybody. Okay, so Olivia, do you have one that you want to start with?
Yeah, actually, I was listening to you and I was reading, you know, with the other half here, the questions, and I think I can make 2 general points that will actually touch upon many of the questions, and maybe building on what you were saying, and how by just recognizing the Senegalese and the Sikh and everybody that actually participated in the world wars that was not white, how that is not necessarily to be equated with decolonization or decolonial thought in and of itself. And the most straightforward way to make that distinction is actually the distinction between pluralizing or the multicultural or whatever what we could do in everyday life, and then the idea of decoloniality. And so the way to actually, one is about adding stuff and stirring and saying it looks nicer. And I think that's the Maya, you were talking about the performative thing beforehand, right? Where we say, oh, we're gonna stop having all male panels, we're gonna stop having only white panels, stuff like that. And then we add the desired color and gender diversity, and then we feel that we've done something. I would say that's a minimal condition. It is something, and you can think about your syllabus in the same way, right? So what are the people that we put forward as part of the canon? Do we add poetry? Do we add theater stuff? Do we actually pluralize what we consider expertise? I would say it's the minimum condition to even think about decoloniality. And it comes from the recognition that we have muted, silenced the majority of knowledge out there in the world. And again, it serves a particular purpose of the status quo, which is coloniality. So for me then to move from that, so recognizing that the Senegalese soldiers were there, to the point where you actually are able to make a much more sustained critique of why the world wars were needed first and foremost, but also where you fundamentally can alter how we understand all those different actors, is on the one hand, obviously denaturalizing the ideas of nationalism, natural borders, and the political borders and anything that comes with that. We think today of the refugee crisis, for instance. A decolonial approach to that is not just being nicer to refugees and letting them in and not having them drawn. It's literally, how come some people die when they cross the border and others don't? And that has to do with who gets to live and who gets to die, and what are all the different knowledges that we produce that make that invisible and normal, right? And so in the same way, we could say for the world wars, it's about actually starting to say how ridiculous is it to consider our European nations, both the victors, but also the good guys of the world wars, if at the same time they were killing more or considerable amount of people, as we've seen in the Holocaust and the Nazi apparatus of the Holocaust, right? So what makes it that in the way we teach everything that is in the social sciences, that the millions that died in India and in the Congo just before the world wars, and then the 6 million, it's not even about comparing deaths or anything, it's about understanding which deaths are acceptable and which are not. And so for me, if we have many of the questions are, how do I change my syllabus? How do I change the research that I do? Is trying to find in whatever thing that you're studying, even if it's European integration, which seems as if it's not a post-colonial or colonial topic, but European integration, Europe has never been an island. What was happening, or what was Europe doing in the rest of the world at the time that we are celebrating the birth of Europe? Or years later, we're giving them the Nobel Peace Prize, for instance. While we're waging wars all over the world, we still managed to get a peace prize for ourselves. So for me, this would be the ways to answer a lot of the question in terms of, is it going beyond Western? What do I need to add? How do I go about it? It's not so much who literally is in your syllabus, but what are the things that are completely eclipsed because we have been taught to think of Europe in isolation or the Western world in isolation, and it's never been that.
Sure. Thank you. Gulsha.
I think Olivia sort of covered a lot of what I wanted to say, but I'll try to go into a bit more detail. Like she said, a lot of the questions are about decolonizing the curriculum, at least to the extent I was able to keep track of them. And going with this, some specific questions, for example, one of them mentioned, how would you teach Western political thought, right? And again, it goes into what I think Olivia was saying in terms of what do we understand to be Western, right? What do we understand to be political thought? And all those different thinkers who were sort of silenced or forgotten. And the one name that I sort of remembered is Anton Wilhelm Amo, who is actually was brought in from Ghana by one of the dukes in the German Empire, a black man, the first black man in Germany to receive a PhD in philosophy, right? And it's 1720s, I think, right? So you want to talk about Western political thought, he is Western political thought, right? So again, it's about, it's not that, it again goes back to the discussion, is that the knowledge is already there, right? We don't actually have to find anything that is not there. We just have to sort of rethink how we approach these knowledges, right? What do we understand to be Western, but also in, you know, if you're decolonizing, let's say, European studies, what do we understand to be Europe? How do we understand the different hierarchies within Europe, but also the different relationships European nation states had in their colonial endeavors? Right. So, I mean, I think that there was that discussion when there was the financial crisis in Greece, how a lot of the ways the crisis was actually framed was through colonial language, about backwardness, about laziness. So all those hierarchies are already there. And you have to sort of go a bit deeper into that. And I think, and someone also asked about, you know, poems and theater, you know, how do they link with IR? And I think that's exactly how it links, because if we look at it at the basis of it, IR is about power, it's about humans, it's about the different ways of relating to each other. And that's all in poetry, that's all in theater, that's all in songs, right? You can do this all through even, you know, dances. You don't actually need to go to a library and read, you know, sort of kind of boring books. And there is a world out there where people have regulated their relationships, not just based on, you know, all these abstract concepts. Actually, majority of people have not based their relationships on these abstract concepts, right? So how do they relate to each other? Would be a way to start thinking about it. I'm sorry.
Great. Thanks. I think I'll try and pick up the questions about research and then a couple of things about the curriculum. So research, I mean, I think this is a key area, and for those familiar with some of the work on this field, research can be the most colonial of practices. So a good reference point, if you want to start thinking about this, is Linda Toohey-Smith's Decolonizing methodologies. And the first thing she says there is that to many Indigenous people, research is a dirty word. Why? Because very often researchers come in, they extract data from Indigenous peoples, often without consent, often without care and respect of treatment. They then use this data to confect some knowledge about the community. It's never answerable to them. It gets published. It makes the researcher money and gives them prestige and status, but very little benefit, if any, flows back to the Indigenous community. In fact, the Indigenous community itself can be left more vulnerable to expropriation or so on, right? To put a very crude analogy on it, if you think about the film Avatar, they send in the anthropologists, right, to study the natives of the planet. And in order to find their most vulnerable points, in order to try and move them before this extractive industry takes off. Now, of course, a lot of research doesn't take place quite so nakedly in the service of corporate extraction. However, lots of it does take place at a slightly more arm's length relationship, nonetheless, to national, governmental, state and military objectives. So the question is in research, for me, who are the subjects? And how do we stop the subjects rendering everything else their objects, right? So for me, the challenge in trying to do my research or the research in Mozambique was like, who is speaking and who's being spoken for? Who's able to access the knowledge? How is it produced? Who do you speak back to? And anthropologists have been dealing with these questions better. And I think this is noted in one of the questions as well. So I think we have to be very careful as a research community to do several things. First, to absolutely respect the subjectivity and sovereignty of our interlocutors, our informants, our agents, to report back to them, to be answerable to them, to do informed consent, and all of the things which I think we're doing much better these days. But cognizant of the ways in which it's so easy to become an extractive kind of force as a researcher and an exploitative force. Second is to think about how to essentially practice redistribution amongst the international research community, right? So how can researchers in the global north solidaristically share their resources in terms of access to books, training, all the rest of it, with colleagues in the global south? How can they actually encourage the developing and the defining of research questions from the people who are themselves the primary kind of subjects? That's something which is quite difficult to do for various reasons. The professional incentives that we have in the global north is actually to own and to extract and to appropriate all of this stuff for ourselves. So how do we cut against those norms? Can we build new norms about research funding, about research publishing, that actually give presence and priority to the colleagues that we're thinking about? I'll briefly touch on teaching and then we'll maybe go to some more questions. So the teaching question is something, I'll give a little plug here to the work we did at SOAS. And you can Google Decolonizing the Curriculum Toolkit. So what we did when we were having this conversation is we tried to give people a set of questions to ask themselves. So I would say, because a couple of people have asked questions about their syllabuses or their approaches, or, you know, if they're teaching Europe as a topic, how would you decolonize that? I think it's all about the sensibility that you bring to a particular subject. It's not that every module has to have X number of writers from here and there. They may not have written about Slovenia, or they may not have written about, you know, Eastern European integration. The point is to be able to make visible the kinds of connections and hierarchies and relationships that this global structure has kind of brought about. And I think there's lots of interesting work here connecting post-socialism and postcolonial theory, as already noted in the chat. As part of BISA, the post-socialist and the colonial post-colonial working groups actually had a joint workshop, and using things like Orientalism to look at the Balkans and so on is something that's being done. What I like about postcolonial theory is that once you get to the root of it, what you're thinking about is how political science or social science in general sets up a hierarchy of disposability, right? How does our language, how do our concepts set up a hierarchy of disposability? And that can be, I actually think that's a language we can use to talk about gender, class, race, disability, and different nations, like sort of global hierarchies. And you'll often find the same kinds of tropes and the same kinds of language used to discuss the Balkans and Greece as were used to discuss African states and so on. Even the same structural adjustment policies, you know, came home to Europe after being explored in the rest of the world. So yeah, I think in teaching it's important not so much the concrete content of what you're doing, but the sensibilities that you bring to it. And then you kind of have to creatively work it out for yourselves. The other thing I would say, though, is that it takes a lot of time to rethink all this stuff, right? You have to do new research, you have to do new thinking, you have to do a lot of reading, and institutions will all be happy for you to jazz up your syllabus and say, hey, I've decolonized my curriculum, but won't often recognize it in your workload. So the first thing I always say is, this stuff takes time. If institutions want to show off and say that they're doing this thing, they have to resource it. They have to give the teachers time. Okay, right. Olivia and Gulsha, are there other questions that you've picked out of the chat that you want to speak to, or are there any other points you want to look at?
Yeah, I think the two last questions speak to hierarchies of knowledge and what is being taken seriously or not, and how that works. I think that's a really important one, and it also touches upon what you were saying there before about knowledge extraction and then the relationship between global north, global south. So I think the starting point would be to actually acknowledge that there is, even amongst decolonial scholars, a lot of the insights that came from decolonial thought is literally, as was mentioned before, not necessarily people in the ivory tower, but a lot of indigenous feminist thought that might not have been formulated as such, and often in languages that we have no inkling about. And then they end up in our attention, let's say, in the Western Academy through white or mestizo scholars from officially the global south that maybe end up in the global north, the same as, you know, all three of us, the way we look, whatever, like we have a particular geographic location that makes that it can even be heard in a place like something like ECPR. So we don't have to be, maybe it's important actually to acknowledge that those hierarchies continue even within these initiatives that we might have to actually break through them. So some of the things that Mia was saying is really important. How do you, at the very macro level of how you organize your own research, try to mitigate that without thinking? Because maybe that's something that is maybe very painful to acknowledge, but the university was never necessarily made as a place where we can actually, in a sustainable way, produce anti-systemic knowledge. So in and of itself, actually thinking about decolonizing reality, knowledge, whatever, the university might be one of the last places where that will ever be possible. And I know Mia asked us about the future or whatever, but this is not to be necessarily super pessimistic. It's really about, let's also not be naive about this, right? So for me, the way that I try to make sense of my presence in an institution that, for which I know that it was not made to do whatever we put our mind to, is to somehow occupy spaces that are also ours and take some resources for something that we think is important, rather than thinking, if I do this, in 5 years' time, the university will be decolonized. And so the same goes for how do we produce knowledge globally and, you know, produce, cultivate, exchange, co-produce, knowing that if you are affiliated to a university in the global south, apart from not having access to all the different journals and that whole business model where we write for free and then, you know, the publishing houses make money, all of it doesn't make sense at all. So in that sense, I think it's important to be as anarchical as we can and be sharing in that. But additionally, I would also say, let's try and fight this idea that we hold the most legitimate knowledge, because it's actually the opposite. Like, there is no ground that actually makes, let's say, if we just take the field of, you know, African studies, it's insane how few Africans, people connected to the continent, are part of the official body of experts on that continent. We would never accept that for any place in Europe, let's say. And so when we say, oh, in decolonizing, you know, let's do trainings for colleagues in the global south so that they know how to publish in academic journals in a very short time, that's a nice thing to do, because, you know, then at least our colleagues end up in the same very faulty journals that we publish in. But the actual, for me, decolonial thought about that is that we in the global north need a much more extensive training if we ever want to continue to speak of the global south, which we have no constitutive relation often. And I even say this as a person from the continent. So in the short term also, it requires us to refuse certain topics. If you do not speak the language of a particular place, if you actually have no democratic connection to it, that the moment that you're bored about the topic, you just go home and go and source another country, don't forget that you have your colleagues there that actually can do that work so much better than you can do. And again, now I'm speaking from the European or global north. So for me, that's how I see decolonization also often means, how can I end certain impositions? I've called it ethical retreat or whatever. Like moving away can also be something to think about next to redistribution.
Yeah, that not occupying space, which we all do, so, you know, how we structure ourselves. Gosha, do you want to speak to this issue or anything else from that's picked up in the chat? Again, I'm really sorry, this feels very inadequate way of engaging with the questions.
Just a couple of points about the hierarchies of knowledge, which I think does, again, touch upon a lot of the questions. One of those is, it does go into what Olivia was saying about the hierarchies, even within, you know, people with a claim to criticality, whether it's post-colonial, decolonial, or whatnot. One of the things, in terms of that division between global South and global North, one of the things that still continues to bother me to this day is even the most critical conference will not have a budget for visa fees. It's, you know, visa fees are ridiculous and no one ever takes that into account, right? And it's a very specific sort of problem, but it also tells you from whose perspective all these conference budgets are being set up, right? So it's very small, but, and then going back to in whose name we speak sort of thing. I think there's always these hierarchies that are very, very hard to unentangle, in the sense of how area studies were set up and how area studies were, in a sense, you know, very similar to that anthropological relationship. Area studies were the space where then the IR theorists went to extract knowledge to build their IR theory sort of relationship. And and I always find that, and this is, I don't have a solution for it, but just a reflection, very hard to navigate. Because whenever I enter a new space, everyone says, well, will you teach on Turkey? And I keep thinking, I know nothing about Turkey. You know, I mean, not enough to teach. Or they go even one step further and say, oh, can you talk to us about the Ottoman Empire? And I'm like, no. And again, I think even just from being from one space does not give one authority to speak on it. But there's also the other hierarchy there, whereby by virtue of your identity, this is all you should be speaking on, right? And it's very complex. I don't have an answer how to unentangle all those hierarchies, but I think they all come together, yeah.
No, and I think that's good. I just wanted to bounce off that point, because I think there's a tension amongst people who are doing this work themselves, because that claim to authenticity, on the one hand, it's necessary, right? Because you are saying something about being rooted in a place gives you a different relationship to it than being distant from and detachable from that place, right? That's a different relationship. It's a different epistemic relationship. It's a different ethical relationship. On the other hand, we don't want to just valorize authenticity uncritically, and also we want to recognize the way in which it can be weaponized to put down others who want to speak differently about that space. So this is a tension. Of course, we often see patriarchies defended as traditional or indigenous to a particular society, and therefore beyond question, right? So that's one way in which that can go. The way in which I try to navigate these things theoretically is I lean quite a lot on standpoint theory, but I think there's space for criticality within standpoint theory. So if you remember, standpoint theory is essentially the claim that different people see things differently depending on where you sit in a social structure, right? So the classic examples given by scholars like Patricia Hill Collins is that And it's also the claim that if you're in a position of subjugation, sometimes you can see things which the people at the top cannot see, right? This is a key claim. And so the idea is that in the United States, Black women understand society more inclusively because they have to navigate these structures of patriarchy and racism in a way that white men and white women don't necessarily have to, right? You have to be very familiar with your system of oppression in order to survive it. And so that's not a claim to authenticity because I am Black and because I'm a woman, therefore I speak for the positionality of Black women. It's saying that because I'm Black and because I'm a woman, what that concretely means is that I'm subject to these kinds of power relations most of the time. But then that's compatible with the idea that Condoleezza Rice may not be the most representative Black woman in America, right? Because she sits in a very different position. Her positionality vis-a-vis the state and so on is quite different. So that's one issue which I think is worth kind of bringing up. I wanted to just touch on one more question in the chat, which says, what do we think about the recent debate in IR and the constitutive other? And do you think that that's a good way of looking at the relations between all sides? So I wanted to reflect a little bit on this because I think this idea has been quite popular within Europe, and European IR in particular has become the home of constructivism, where it's all about self-other relations, it's all about identity, it's all about friendships and so on. And this is in a way to theorize the European integration over the last few decades, right? How is it that Europe's gone from a position of total war to open borders essentially in 50 or 60 years? And so a lot of it is about the changing nature of self-other relationships. So I would say that, yes, this is important up to a point. I think the problem is it too much relies on the coherence and the cohesion of a self. So a lot of the stuff that we see in discussions about ontological security or national identity and so on, I think rely on the idea that even though the self is kind of constructed, it's nonetheless kind of coherent. Whereas I think at least a post-colonial sensibility about the discussion about self-other relationships is that it is also bound up with what you're trying not to see. And that is, if you like, the other in the self or so on. Or even the kind of constitutive relationship of the self to power. I'll make this more concrete with an example. One of the ways in which IR talks about sovereignty and the emergence of countries is through more nations joining the European club, right? So the European club is a gentleman's club with its own rules and standards of civilization and so on. And what happens with decolonization is that more people are admitted into the club. So it's about others coming into it. Whereas if you take that analogy and take it in a different direction, what you actually have is a club in which certain people are members and other people are servants and cooks and groundskeepers. They're already inside the club, but they don't have membership, right? So it's not that they are the other. They could actually be the closest person to you all the time. They could be bringing you your drinks all the time, but they are not in your idea of who is human. So I think that's one of the dangers that this inside-outside focus can kind of obscure, is that what is already always inside. Okay, so how are we doing for time? We've got about 6 minutes left on the clock, and I know that there are a few more questions. Gulsha and Olivia, are there other questions you want to pick up and speak to, or if anybody has more questions that they want to put into the chat, please do. Otherwise, maybe I can ask you to summarize maybe your sense of what the future is going to be like, or what you think needs to happen next, or even what you would exhort colleagues in the discipline to do.
Yeah, and maybe for me it's easier to riff off on your example of the gentleman's club, because it comes back to, and it can be also by way of concluding what it, like, to reiterate what we actually mean when we say decolonizing. That is not just adding people to the club or being inclusive or stirring or. And so one thing that also comes from what we were saying before about authenticity, and I think the one the one element of Western thought, which again, there's a lot of diversity within that, whatever, but that we should really revisit when we want to be serious about anti-colonialism, is the ease with which everything is reduced to the individual. And the same comes actually to the stress that we might have about, oh no, I'm not going to be an ethical researcher, and if I do this, I'm not authentic enough, or I'm too white to research this place. I think the points that people need to make when we talk about standpoint theory, or when we talk about who are the experts in African studies, for instance, it's never a conversation about the individual or the individual researcher. It's actually trying to take 2-3 steps back and look at the collective or the structure, and who is systematically absent is a much more interesting question than, am I allowed to interview this indigenous person, right? And so what then becomes is actually a collective responsibility to reshape your own fields so that it reflects or it makes more sense to the world that you try to understand or describe. And then within that, you can carve out your own space. And that's what I mean with decolonization is not about censorship or about censoring yourself, but it's, for instance, I am a second generation Rwandan and I do not understand Kinyarwanda, but I have a particular closeness to the country via my family, but also my personal interest into it. There are elements of it that I could study, and I bring it back to Europe to make it make a theoretical point about how Europe should behave internationally. At no point, if anybody calls me as a Rwanda expert, will I answer as a Rwanda expert, because I'm not. You cannot be an expert of a place if you don't. I think, like in the way that we use country experts. We don't have UK experts, because if you study the UK, you're an expert about something specific, but not the whole. So that for me would be, let's try, and often when we have anxieties about pluralizing, decolonizing, whatever, it's because we reduce the whole problem to our individual choices. And I would come back to the point, is literally not about us. And then the other thing about it, which is much more difficult, is to understand that this European Gentleman Club, the way it is constituted and what we celebrate of it, is literally what created all the cooks and servants and slaves and their existence. It is completely linked to that so-called image that we have of this beautiful gentleman's club. So in that sense, even the desire to include others in it is so deeply colonial that we actually realize that the conversation we need to have is how do we dismantle this gentleman's club so that it becomes so radically something different that the other self lines are going to be completely something different. And I think there was also a question about how come we don't have more traction, or how come this, because the most radical aspects, and it's not just decolonial thought, I think a lot of anarchist thought or abolitionist thought or post-structural thought that actually touches on the constitutive murderous nature of most of the things that we celebrate, of the institutions that we inhabit in this world, need to be addressed. It's not just about cleaning it up a little bit. It's about trying to understand how deeply Europe can only be because of the colony and transatlantic slavery. And that's why we're not having the conversation. So that in that context for me, and this is where I would end, is let's try and think, how does the individual researcher then, or the political persons that we are as well, how do we feature in that, and how much can we commit ourselves to try and understand it slightly more deeply than being congratulated that our reading lists feature 50% women and some people of color, right? And so that for me is the future thing that does not allow us to just be optimistic, but I think it's an important project that gives me energy, because it's a project that makes us understand Black Lives Matters today, for instance, just to say those things are connected. It's not, yeah. So it's about how do we understand the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gulsha.
I'm not sure I have much to add in the sense that what comes into the future is, I think, focusing on the systemic part of things, right? On the institutional part of things, in the sense that, again, from my example, me teaching one course doesn't really alter the structure of university itself. It's the structure of university, the structure of knowledge production, politics of citation, all this entire edifice itself is a problem. So I think also, at times one can become a little too self-indulgent in thinking, oh, well, I did this, and be proud of themselves. But I think we have to keep thinking that this is an endless sort of process, but also it really is not about the individual, right? What I might be able to do and what another person might be able to do has to all come back to the institution. Because part of the issue I have right now is, I think it was mentioned before, in German universities right now as well. The reason I have the space I have is because pluralism became something to advertise, right? The university wants to tell everyone they have the postcolonial course. So there is some sort of negotiation that goes in there, in the sense that you are allowed in this space right now because they don't really see you as a threat. And that's sort of disheartening.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, so my students really keep me on my toes. That I'm like, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do the other thing. And they're like, but are you able to sever the relationship between the university and the Ministry of Defense? Or are you able to, do this? And you're like, okay, this is a much bigger question than anything I have authority over, and good for raising it, and, pursue the conversation. But the good thing and the bad thing about students is they don't really believe in sticking to what's possible. So it kind of will push you on. Yeah, I mean, I think to sum up, thank you very much to our panel for their comments. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, maybe to read some of the stuff that they've written on it, and also to reach out to us. I mean, I think it's a shame. The good thing about this is access, obviously, online, but the bad thing is that it's those follow-up conversations that you have after the panel, which are always the best part of the conference, don't necessarily happen. So please, I think I'm presumptively speaking for all of us when I say please shoot us an email if you want to follow up, or if you have a question to ask, or if you want to exchange notes on readings and that kind of thing. I think we'd all be happy to engage. And also think about, the spaces that you're in, where you do hold power, the journals that you sit on, the committees that you serve, the peer reviews that you do. These are all spaces in which we can, I suppose, make a difference. Okay, so with that, I'll also apologize for not answering quite all of the questions in the chat, but it's been lovely to be here. Thank you for the feedback, and yeah, have a good conference. Okay, bye-bye.